My name's Alice. I came here from Maine today. I'm the author of the book you see on the board, which was the result of over 10 years of doing pasture-based pork up in Maine. We did what they call farrow to finish in the pork world. So we would breed the grown-ups and take care of the babies from birth all the way up until slaughter, and then start over again. It says on the back of my book we had the largest certified organic hog operation in the state of Maine, which is kind of like saying you're a jumbo shrimp. It was absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things, but we did about 100 or so finishers every year, plus some piglets for the piglet market, from between 6 and 8 sows at a time. So sort of a small to mid-scale operation for New England.
And did you start really small?
We started really small. So, in 2005, I got a litter of, it wasn't even a full litter, I think it was 4 or 5 pigs in the spring, and raised them out to slaughter and slaughtered them in the fall. And we did that for a few years of just buying feeder pigs and then and slaughtering, and eventually found that for one thing, certified organic piglets were very difficult to find, extremely expensive, and we just didn't have the control that we wanted over our genetics and the timing and all of that. So that's how we ended up getting into the breeding and farrowing end a few years later. And I always do recommend to people that you do start that way with buying the feeder pigs and raising them out. It's an easy way to start on a very small scale. As soon as you get 1 sow, you're looking at, if all goes well, at least 8 or 10 pigs that you end up taking care of. And just it makes everything about 500 times more complicated. But it does have its rewards. But if you're new to pigs, I do recommend starting out with some feeder pigs and trying that kind of cycle a few times before you dive head first into breeding and farrowing. Before you even start, you have to figure out how you're going to start. Where are your genetics coming from, and how are you managing your breeding herd? Where are you even getting your breeding herd from? A lot of people raise their own replacement stock on the farm. That's mostly what I did. I should clarify, I don't keep pigs anymore, so you're going to hear me talking in the past tense a lot. I started working 5 years ago for a farm supply company, and they slowly took more and more and more of my time until I couldn't farm anymore, which gave me time to write a book. But I have no pigs right now, so I'll be speaking about them in the past tense. But we did mostly raise our own replacements on farm for the ladies. And there's a lot of advantages in doing that. For one thing, most hog producers in the industry at large don't have the same goals that we have as small-scale pasture-based producers. And each individual farm and each individual location with their own goals for what they want their end product to look like is going to be a little bit different. And so keeping tight control over your own genetics and exaggerating the traits that you already have present on your farm to go farther in the direction you want to go can really create a specialized product for your own farm and for your own market. But beyond that, there are other advantages as well, and one is biosecurity. If you're not bringing animals in from off the farm, you don't have to worry about bringing diseases in from off the farm. And so it removes a whole series of headaches in that department. I got to check my notes on my phone because I wasn't able to get them up on the computer screen. I want to make sure I don't forget anything. The disadvantages of on-the-farm replacements are sort of the inverse of being able to exaggerate and specialize in what you already have. You can't get anything that you don't already have. And so if what you have on your farm is a genetic pool of lard hogs and you want something that's, a more lean bacon type, then it's going to take you forever and multiple generations to breed that out of the stock that you already have, whereas you can go off farm and find exactly what you're looking for and bring it on. Another disadvantage is that on a small farm with a limited genetic pool, over time you're going to start running into problems with inbreeding. That's mainly a problem if you're trying to raise all of your own replacement stock, including the males. You can keep the same line of females going for a very long time without problems. But raising your own replacement boars on farm is difficult, not just because of the inbreeding, but also because you have to deal with getting those males from piglet stage up to puberty. They have to be managed completely differently from all of your grower stock. You can't have that uncastrated male sitting in a grower pen hanging out with growing females. And so usually on a small farm, the on-farm replacement option is only practical for your sows and not for your boars. And so while we raised all of our replacement gilts on farm, we would go buy live boars from off the farm. And you can, if you're working with other producers in your area, you can often find somebody who has at least similar production goals to your own, whose biosecurity practices you trust. You can go and see the animals in person and get to know them in real life instead of just from photos. And you can inspect the facilities that they come from and talk with the breeder and bring in genetics that you don't currently have, but still have some of that personal touch and that local flavor to the genetic stock. Purchase stock, however, is the biggest biosecurity headache. A lot of small producers like to cut corners in biosecurity, so they just go buy a pig from their neighbor and bring it home, and they throw it straight in the pen with all the ladies. And it doesn't matter how small a producer you are or how much you trust your source. It's really important to take the time to quarantine new animals and have them tested for diseases that might affect their reproductive ability, which I'll get into later. People can sell you problems that they don't know they have. That happens to me on my farm. Somebody sold me a boar that had a leptospirosis infection that I didn't know about, and it dropped our reproductive rates dramatically for over a year until we got that problem cleaned up. And so when you're buying just replacement boars, you only have to do that once with one animal every couple of years, and it's a headache, but you do it, and it's manageable. If you want to avoid that sort of thing entirely, your only other option is artificial insemination, which is it not only eliminates that process of quarantine and testing. They do a lot of testing for you, not only for diseases like porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome is one that they test for regularly on the stud farms, but they also test for genetic conditions that most of your state labs aren't going to be testing for. And so they often have a very clear idea of the genetics that they're selling. Artificial insemination gives you access to some of the best production genetics in the country, far higher quality animals than you might be able to find locally in New England. But those are not necessarily the best pasture genetics. They're mostly stud farms are geared toward the larger industrial operations, so they're producing animals that have great feed efficiency and huge litter sizes, but not necessarily hardiness and foraging ability or mothering ability outside of a confinement operation. So that can be a bit of a trade-off. When you buy hog semen, you have a whole catalog to go through. I think of it as like the internet dating of the livestock world. It'll be like they have these pictures of, I mean, like the boar in this picture, just these, show animals that look amazing, and it'll be like, Bo has a large frame and, deep reproductive capabilities, and you're like, does he like to lift weights on the weekends and he doesn't really want anything serious? But it really, I think that used in balance with an on-farm breeding program or using local stock from pastured herds, it can work really well as long as people are aware of the limitations of those genetics, as well as all of the glossy good things that the people selling those genetics have to say about them. You also have to consider what kind of genetics you're buying at all. People get very interested in different pure breeds of hog, especially heritage breeds. On the top, you can see Herefords, which have this same. It's actually a relatively recent breed. That's not one of the real ancient breeds. It was bred to have the same coloration as the Hereford cow, with the red body and the white head. They're charming animals. Do really well on pasture. Sort of a lean bacon type of hog. And on the bottom are Hungarian Mangalitsa's, which have a cult following in the restaurant crowd especially. They're extremely hardy, really high levels of fat, not practical for most pork production, but like I say, some people will pay top dollar for them. And a friend of mine who came from Charlotte, North Carolina, saw one at the country fair and thought it was a sheep. They have this, real thick curly wool on them that keeps them warm in ranging conditions, even in very cold temperatures. And so, these pure breeds can bring these like readily identifiable characteristics like that. You can say like, oh, I want an animal that is really good at foraging and will perform well on a high-fiber diet. If you get a Tamworth, you're getting some of that. But I don't think that raising a strictly purebred herd is the ideal solution for most pork producers. It limits where you can buy your animals from. The stock is more expensive, and when you start crossbreeding animals from different breeds, you get the advantage of what they call hybrid vigor. Crossbred animals with a more diverse genetic pool tend to be healthier, grow faster, and be more efficient. And so unless you have unless your goal is to specifically to preserve those old heritage breeds, and you have a market for registered stock, and you're ready to commit to maintaining and improving that breed according to the breed standards, then I would take advantage of pure breeds for those characteristics that they can bring into your herd, but be open-minded about what breeds you choose from, and consider crossbreds, whether they're deliberate hybrid crosses between two pure breeds, or just maintaining a crossbred herd and bringing in boars of different breeds depending on what direction you want to take your herd. All other things being equal, I think crossbred herds are more fun to look at. Those are some of my pigs on the far right, and they just came in all different colors and speckles and splotches, and they were pretty to take pictures of. The other thing that I wanted to mention about pure breeds is that people do get really more hung up than they should be on the characteristics that those breeds are famous for. It's like in terms of the Mangalitsas, like really tasty fat, and there is a niche market for them because they have a reputation for having really tasty fat, but what affects things like pork quality and performance more than the pure breed you choose is your feeding program and your production methods. I think that there's, all pigs are fundamentally bred to produce meat. Some of them were originally bred to produce more fat, and some of them were originally bred to produce more lean meat, but they were all for eating. It's not like cows where there are breeds that are for dairy and breeds that are for beef, and you would never in your right mind buy an Angus if your goal was to make cheese. There's just relatively little difference among pig breeds compared to breeds of some other livestock. And so I would definitely worry more about your pasture program, your feeding program, and your healthcare program than a specific pure breed. And I think I touched earlier on, especially among the heritage breeds, the genetic pool is small, which means that inbreeding does become a concern, which is not only poor for the overall health of that breed, but will also reduce the productivity of your individual animals. And so even if you're raising all Mangalitsas and you go buy a Mangalitsa from another farm, it may still be from the same family line. So it's important to learn about the different strains and family lines of the pure breed that you're involved with, be in close touch with the breed organization, and educate yourself about the actual shape of the genetic pool. For production purposes, it's okay to have a certain amount of inbreeding. If you have a high-quality line without a lot of deleterious recessive genes, you can breed offspring back to parents or sibling to sibling and use the results of that mating for meat, but you would not want to save those animals for breeding again. I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the pure breeds, with an emphasis on the characteristics that they particularly shine in, and traits that you may be particularly looking to bring in. Lean meat productivity is those are your dollars and cents on the farm. While some of the old lard breeds are really cool and the genetics are worth saving, for people who are trying to actually make money with pigs, then what's going to do that for you is being able to bring more pounds of pork chops and bacon to the farmer's market. And that means being able to pack on a lot of meat on as little feed as possible. And the breeds that are particularly good at this are Landrace, which is down here at the bottom, and Yorkshire up here at the top. And the Hampshires, which are some of my favorites, black pigs with the white belts. These are all long, lean animals that turn their feed into muscle instead of into fat, and do so quickly. A lot of the breeds that are best at lean meat productivity are the ones that have been selected by the larger operations, and so often to produce at their highest capability, they need to be raised in environments that are tightly controlled. And so these breeds not crossed with other breeds may have trouble maintaining their health and productivity in an outdoor situation. One that's particularly easy to notice is these white breeds like the Landrace and the Yorkshire. If you put them out on pasture and they're not used to it, or you don't provide enough shelter, they sunburn very easily. I've seen white pigs that got transferred from an indoor facility to an outdoor facility and didn't know enough to go inside when the sun was hot in the middle of the day, and they literally got like blisters behind their ears. The sunburn got so bad. So the darker colored pigs are really best for pasture operations. A trait that many pasture-based operations are interested in that is of absolutely no use to the big guys in Iowa is the ability to maintain productivity on a high-fiber diet. People who want to reduce their grain use by pasturing hogs or by feeding waste products are feeding a diet that's higher in fiber than the average industrial diet. And that can limit feed efficiency. But some breeds will maintain their productivity better on a diet like that. And that includes the Mangalitsa. Here's another of our fuzzy woolly pigs. The American Guinea Hog, which is a really popular homestead hog. They're extremely gentle. They're smaller framed animals. They do really well in pasture situations. They'll even get unhealthily fat if they're fed too much grain. The large black is probably my all-time favorite pure breed. I used it heavily in my breeding programs. They do well on pasture, but of these sort of more heritage breeds, they are also the most efficient in general. They will grow quickly and lean, and they'll maintain their ability to do that if they're fed a lot of waste products or grass. And then Tamworths are also extremely popular on pasture-based operations. You see a lot of farms that raise purebred herds for pork markets rely heavily on Tamworths. And my only caution about Tamworths is that they are a little on the aggressive side. They're pushy. And so people who are either just small and not very strong, or people who don't have a lot of experience with livestock, if you're not ready to get pushed around by a pig, choose a different breed. The large blacks are extremely calm. Some people claim it's because those long ears go over their eyes and they can't even see where they're going. I don't know if that's true or not, but they are very sweet animals. But the Tamworth's active nature is partly what makes it a good pasture pig, because they're very active foragers. Some pigs are too lazy to do a lot of foraging, and the Tamworth will be out there looking for stuff to eat. And if you are breeding your pigs and on farm, then reproductive efficiency becomes quite important. And the breeds that are known for producing lots of piglets and lots of milk are again the Landrace and the Yorkshire. These are also traits that are important on large-scale commercial farms. But also the Poland China, which I believe holds the world record for most piglets in a litter. It was something up over 30 pigs, which is 3 times the normal. And the Gloucestershire Old Spot, which is another, that's a more heritage breed. Sorry for going back and forth between these screens. So when you're selecting the animals that you're going to breed, you need to be looking, obviously, at their conformation, looking for high-quality animals. And for selecting breed stock, there's 2 types of conformation that you need to think about. There's their production conformation, what they look like as slaughter animals, because obviously you're trying to produce high-quality slaughter animals. But then also their reproductive conformation, which doesn't really matter if you're just going to turn something into bacon, but it does matter if you're going to breed it. There's not really any such thing as a perfect pig, because that depends on the breed that you're working with and what it's supposed to look like and your own production goals. So, the big guys in Iowa want practically as little back fat as possible. They're looking for the Victoria's Secret models of the pig world. And people who are growing the heritage Mangalitsas want, the Mangalitsas are supposed to be a lard hog. They should be round. They should be short-coupled. They should look like a Mangalitsa. So those are sort of subjective, and it'll depend on the farm. But there are definitely certain things that you always want. One thing that's very important is leg conformation. You want an animal with healthy, flexible joints. One fault that you'll often see in pigs is what they call a post leg, where there's this hock joint is barely visible and it just goes straight down. And it limits mobility, and those animals tend to go lame. Pigs are holding a lot of weight over those 4 little trotters. And if their legs are not strong and healthy, they won't be able to do that, and they'll be lame, and they'll have to really get put down. For most farms, working with your average heritage bacon breed or with crossbreeds, you want to be looking for a heavy ham That's the largest primal cut. It's where a lot of the weight of the lean meat is carried, and a heavy upper shoulder. You want a lot of length in between the shoulder blade and the front of the ham. And a really big one for me that doesn't get talked about as often is breadth across the back. I want to be able to put on a slaughter-sized hog, I should be able to put my hands flat over the top of its rump in front of the hams and still have pigs sticking out on either side. You'll see animals that are sort of shaped like this. That's tiny pork chops. Pork chops are worth a lot of money at the farmer's market, so you want big weight, plenty of room for a loin-eye in there. Check these slides. On the reproductive end, you want, on a boar, you need to make sure that some of this is going to sound really straightforward. You want 2 testicles that are fully in place and even and large and not showing any signs of damage. Check the penis for any signs of damage. Because sometimes you'll see boars that have been used hard and they'll actually have damage to the penis or the sheath, which causes pain, and they won't want to do their job. Breeding animals of either sex should have plenty of nipples. Pigs have a varying number of nipples among individuals, and so you can't really wean more pigs than you have nipples. Piglets will choose a teat and stay with it, and so if you have a sow that has 10 teats and 12 pigs, you're probably going to lose 2 to starvation. And really, there's an old phrase, I don't know if you've ever heard of the hind tit pig before, but it means the smallest, weakest pig, because the hindmost teats don't produce as much milk as the others. And so ideally, you have 2 more teats than your average litter size. Most sows will have between 8 and 14 teats. I would typically insist on 12 or 14 for a breeding animal. I will accept 10 if she is otherwise spectacular, or in a pure breed with a limited genetic pool. But for crossbreeds, insist on 12. Another seems like it should be stupidly obvious, but it happens, and people make mistakes. There's a condition in some female pigs called atresia ani, which means that they don't have an anus, and fecal matter is expelled through the vulva. Obviously, an animal like that can't get bred. She's going to have infection issues and probably a shortened lifespan. A much milder condition that can cause some of the same problems is a tipped vulva. The vulva should be facing directly out. If it's tipped upwards, it will catch manure and be susceptible to contamination and infection. And then you got to look at the numbers as well as the actual animal standing in front of you. And again, there's productivity statistics and reproductive statistics, and they both matter for a breeding herd. So you want to know if you're buying a gilt or buying semen from a boar, they should have all of these statistics available from the source farm. Again, with the exception of maybe pure breeds that are known for being less productive, you want to be looking for at least 10 live pigs per litter. There are some breeds, like American Guinea Hogs, you're never going to see that. Probably it would be rare for an animal of that breed to have that large a litter, but for most breeds, 10 pigs. You want your average birth weight to be at least approaching 2 pounds, or at least 2 pounds. Between 2 and 3 is really best. Smaller pigs are way more likely to die of hypothermia than larger piglets, and there's just a really tight relationship between weight at birth, weight at weaning, and weight at slaughter. So within reason, bigger piglets are better. Obviously, eventually you get to the point where the piglets are so big that they cause farrowing problems, but really with pigs, that's pretty rare. Survival rate at weaning mostly speaks to the mothering ability of the sow more than anything else, unless the source farm has a really terrible healthcare program and they're losing piglets left and right to disease. But you should be looking at 90% survival rates. It's pretty rare to have 100% survival. The pigs are tiny, the sow is huge. You're usually going to lose one or two to crushing or being stepped on. But a sow with good maternal ability, even without stuffing her into a farrowing crate, should be able to keep 90% of her pigs alive. Weaned weight is directly related to birth weight, but also to the milk production of the sow. A pig at 6 weeks old should be at least 20 pounds. If your line is weaning pigs much smaller than that, then there's a milk production issue probably. And then the reproductive lifespan. How many litters can you get out of a sow from this genetic pool before she needs to be retired? Eventually, you'll see higher rates of stillbirths. You'll see reduced milk production, or you'll see an inability to regain body condition after having a litter. But you must be able to get at least 3 litters out of a sow before she retires, or she won't be worth the investment. And a good sow should be able to have between 4 and 6 litters before she needs to be retired. Once these pigs are,
When you're talking about the litters, the number of litters, are you talking like, because I know a lot of times you try and have them have 2 per year. Are you talking about years, or are you talking about like litters total?
Litters total, though I would, it's pretty tough to make farrowing economical if you're not breeding twice a year, because you have an unproductive animal that you're feeding half the year. So unless,
I just didn't know if that meant like 4 to 6 years with the
or
just...
No, just the number of litters matters more. So the productivity stats, once those pigs are weaned, your days of weaning to slaughter, the shorter, the better in terms of efficiency, though that's a statistic that can get stretched too far, definitely, because when animals are old, you can get better pork quality by having a longer grow-out period. But all other things being equal, you don't want to be feeding a pig any longer or more than you have to. The average hanging weight at slaughter is obviously directly related to the number of dollars you're putting in the bank. How much an animal needs to eat to gain that slaughter weight. There might be pigs that have an enormous appetite and will eat a lot, and they'll gain that weight quickly and have a high slaughter weight at 6 months, but you had to really sock the grain to them to get there. Back fat thickness, what number you're looking for there, again, really depends on your farm and the breed. I like about 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches, which strikes a nice balance between plenty of pork chops to sell versus having flavorful, juicy pork. Like, that's enough for most gourmet markets, but still economically viable for the farmer. And then the lean yields. Because your hanging weight is the weight of the pig when it's been killed, scalded, de-haired, gutted. Depending on the slaughterhouse, they might measure the hanging weight with or without the heads and the feet. But then that's different from how much boneless lean meat you get. There are some carcasses that have very heavy skeletons and less meat, and they might weigh the same, but one animal is going to be more valuable on the market than the other because of the ratio of bone to fat to lean. So you should see lean yields of at least on most breeds, you want 50% off the hanging weight should be lean yields. And if it's much less than that, then you're at least going to need to know that and charge accordingly at the market. Another thing that the big guys don't really worry about that we really need to worry about is the temperament. Most people are in small farming not just to put money in the bank, they want to enjoy their day. And so you want to be working around animals that are calm and pleasant. And not just for your quality of life, but also for your safety, because most of us aren't working in facilities that have gates and panels and are tightly controlled. We're often working with our animals in open spaces. We're going into the pens with them and cleaning out manure while they're in there eating. And if you have aggressive animals, that becomes dangerous as well as unpleasant. And it also affects how they interact with each other, too. If you're not keeping all of your sows in gestation crates the entire time they're pregnant, they're probably in a group pen together. And if they're beating up on each other, that's going to cause problems for everybody. So once you have your breeding animals selected, you need to get ready for them to mate. One thing that you need to consider is the age and the size of the animals. You don't want to breed, especially sows, but also boars, too young. Both sexes reach puberty at around 6 months of age. Boars sometimes a little bit earlier, closer to 5 months. I like to wait until they're at least boars, I like to be 7 months at least, and gilts at least 8 months before they breed. I don't really want to gilt farrowing before she's a year old. They're still growing pretty rapidly at that stage, and asking them to put on live weight themselves while producing a litter is really a lot on their system, and it tends to reduce both the size of the first litter and their lifetime productivity. You don't want to, if you're doing live mating, you don't want to have too great a mismatch in size in either direction. 2 to 1 is the biggest mismatch in size that is really acceptable. If you use too small a boar, then he might not even be able to reach. And if he's a young animal and it's his first try, there are cases of him just he really needs to go to therapy after that. He can't even. He's disappointed in himself and he'll never try again. But if a boar is more than twice the size of a sow, you can end up with a broken back, and that's not pretty either. You need to make sure that the animals you're breeding are healthy. They should be tested and or vaccinated, depending on the source of them, for leptospirosis, for porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, which is usually called PRRS, P-E-P-R-R-S, and for porcine parvovirus. They should also be vaccinated for erysipelas, which is a common condition in pastured animals. Any one of those diseases can cause varying kinds of reproductive failure. Often simply a failure, it'll look just like a failure to conceive, and it can take a while to figure out exactly what's going on. They often don't cause, with the exception of erysipelas, those diseases can be present in a breeding herd without causing any acute symptoms. You won't know your animals are sick. They just won't make babies. And they also need to be healthy in terms of body condition. Animals that are too skinny may fail to conceive. Animals that are too fat may have trouble farrowing, or can have increased troubles with mastitis or other milk production problems. Signs of heat, if you're not, it's generally fine to keep your boar just in with a pen of open sows. There's 3 different basic methods of breeding. You can just do pen mating, where you throw them in there with the ladies and just try to catch when things happen, which is fine in most conditions. But some producers with high-value breeding animals don't want to risk injury to their animals by all of the tussling that can happen ahead of time, and so they'll do what's called hand mating. It's just, you notice when she's in heat, you put the 2 animals together, and they're monitored, and then they're separated when it's done, and then you repeat that every 12 to 24 hours as long as she's in heat, which increases the conception rate and the litter size. Or with artificial insemination, you also need to be able to identify when the sow is in heat. And so those signs of heat are, common across most livestock species. It's increased vocalization, there will swollen vulva, mounting behavior. They can get quite pushy sometimes at feeding time. It'll be pretty obvious. And when there's what's called full standing heat, which is when you want to do artificial insemination. If you place pressure on the sow's back directly in front of her hams, a sow that's not in heat will say, "Hey, what are you doing? Get off of me," and walk away. A sow who is in heat will stand there, like stock still. And so that's a pretty clear sign. Some sows have what are called silent heats. They're perfectly fertile, and they will, if you do pen mating with a boar, they'll get pregnant and have normal litters, but it's really difficult to identify when they're in heat from any of those normal signs. A lot of my sows were that way. I always opted for pen mating because I always said the boar had more fun trying to figure out when they were in heat than I did. And so that always worked for me. But if you're doing AI, then you don't want a genetic pool of sows that tends towards silent heats. And I will confess up front that I do not have much personal experience with AI. I always kept a boar. I've seen it done a few times. Are any of you interested in doing AI? Or because I can talk about it, but it will be strictly theoretical for me. I'll skip that part. Ask your vet or your local extension agent. I can say that you can buy semen either fresh or frozen. Most folks buy it fresh, and it has to be kept under very tightly controlled conditions. Like it has to be kept in the lower 60s, and you have to turn it regularly to keep the cells suspended in the solution. But the actual physical technique of that, your local vet or your technician, your extension agent can come out and show you how to do that. But most farmers handle it on their own. You don't have to call the vet out every single time. There's a number of different options for feeding and housing your gestation herd, but mostly it's keep it simple, stupid. What you don't want to do is what the big guys do. I don't know why you would take a sentient being and shove it in a crate for 4 months straight. But I like this version better, where they get to hang out outside and wait for their babies to come. I always just left the bred sows in the pen with the boar in a group after they were bred, and that pretty much always worked. I'd have usually out of my herd of 6 to 8 sows, I'd usually have anywhere from 2 to 4 who were either ready to get bred or had been bred and were somewhere along in their gestation. And those ladies just were housed with the boar. And one advantage of that is that it keeps the boar happier. Even if they're all bred, he has company. And the boar is a lot less aggressive when he's got somebody to hang out with. And it also just makes one group to feed instead of a bunch of individuals. The only time where you might not want to do that is if you have sows that are all different sizes and the smaller ones are getting pushed away from the feed. You can, in most groups, you can prevent that just by having, if you've got 4 sows, you put 4 feed bowls out on the ground, maybe 20 feet apart, and just feed them all, out of each other's reach. And that works most of the time. But if you have a bully in the pen, you may need to separate her or the one that she's picking on. Indoor, for an individual pen, you would want at least 100 square feet per animal and shared covered bedded space. For shared housing, about 64 square feet per animal is enough. And they just need sturdier facilities than growing pigs. If you've raised feeder pigs before, make everything about twice that strong, because these animals are about, up to 4 times that big. And they can be rough on their housing and their food bowls. We always watered our growing pigs out of a 55-gallon barrel filled with water with a nipple drinker threaded through the side. And our stud boar, if you put one of those in his pasture, he'd scratch himself on it and just knock over this 500-pound barrel of water. So we had to come up with something different. The boar and the gestating sows are the cheapest and easiest animals to feed. They will do better than growing animals or lactating animals on high fiber diets and low protein diets. They do need at least 12% crude protein, and they need adequate lysine and methionine to manufacture all of those. They need those amino acids to produce those piglets. So there can be miscarriages if those amino acids or the protein are fundamentally lacking.
What was the other one? Lysine?
Lysine and methionine are the two big ones to look out for. You shouldn't free feed gestating sows. They should not be allowed to eat all that they want to. They should get about 5 pounds a day of a corn-based diet or 6 pounds a day of a small grains-based diet. And they will want to eat more, so it's nice to provide them with plenty of bulky, low-calorie roughage. If they're on pasture, done. That's easy. That'll give them something to do all day. If it's wintertime and they're in a barn, give them plenty of hay to chew on, or vegetables are great, pumpkin, squash, root vegetables, farmer's market leftovers. That'll all help keep them busy. Yep.
So with the 5 to 6 pound thing, like the commercial, like the organic ones, but like
yep.
the feed that they already mix up for you.
Yeah,
kind of thing.
About 5 pounds of that. That's
okay.
Usually corn-based.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because I know it's not like, okay, here's the whole corn.
Right.
Like it's got the first 2 ingredients usually are corn. So
yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, about 5 pounds a day will be right. And you just want to, monitor body condition, of course. If their spines start showing, feed them more. If they're starting to look a little chubby, then cut it back a little. Give them more hay. If you don't give them that roughage and they're just eating that 5 pounds a day, they're going to start looking for a way out because they get bored and they get tummy rumbles and are going to look for something to do. While it's great to have the sows in with the boar while they're pregnant, it's not so great when they have their piglets. Boars are not very paternal figures, and they will eat their own piglets. They look like tasty little snacks. So at least 3 days before your expected farrowing date, probably more like a week, you want to get that sow out from the boar's pen and into either a group farrowing situation or individual housing. And I should mention the expected gestation period. The old timers always said 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. I can never actually remember the number of days in the gestation because that's so easy to remember. And of course, it depends on whether you're talking about July or February, but there's enough natural variation in the length of the gestation that works as well as anything. And so about a week ahead of that, move her out. Group farrowing, which means just having a bunch of sows and all of their piglets all in one space, can work if you have a group of sows that are all about the same size and that are all farrowing within a couple of weeks of each other. And if you can either provide some private little huts inside that group space or some barriers so that just for the farrowing time itself and a couple days afterward, the sow can have some space to herself. And then they can be all allowed to mingle. I did this very cyclical year-round production cycle where I pretty much wanted a litter to be born and a litter to go to slaughter every single month. So I was not able to do group farrowing because the space between the litters was too high. So we did individual housing. But we would try to have the farrowing pens next to each other so the sows could still interact. They just couldn't have more than nose-to-nose contact with each other or with each other's piglets. So on the top you can see, the top one is one of my sows in her individual pen. That was Hazel. She was my favorite pig ever. She was an incredibly productive and easy to work with animal. And this one on the bottom is from my friends Michael and Ryan's place a few towns away. And this is actually a group farrowing barn. This litter was just born. Those were like 2-day-old piglets. But you can see these sows next to her, and they're going to take these gates down in another couple of days so they can all mingle. Usually, even in a group farrowing situation, most piglets will, once they've bonded with their mother in those first couple of days, they will mostly stick to their own mum, but there will be some cross-fostering of the piglets that happens naturally. It kind of depends on what the sows will tolerate. Let's see if I had to say pasture versus indoor. Was there something specific I wanted to mention about that? You can do it in either place. You can farrow on pasture, you can farrow indoors. Really depends on the weather mostly. The young pigs are very sensitive to cold temperatures, and they do need to be protected from drafts and damp and cold weather. So pasture farrowing is really only feasible at the height of summer. In July and August, I actually had a gilt who went crazy right before she had her litter, and we couldn't keep her inside any structure. She busted out through gates that had kept stud boars twice her size in, and she wanted to have her piglets in the hedgerow. And she did. She just went out and farrowed all by herself. We finally found her. She disappeared. We couldn't find her for a while. And a week later, we find this warren of paths through the hedgerow with a den hidden in the middle of it. And she'd built this elaborate nest, and she was very happy. Me, not so much. That was a pain to get her back in. For indoor facilities, if you're certified organic, you can only restrict outdoor access on a very limited basis. It is okay to keep them completely indoors for farrowing and maybe a couple days after, but then they're going to have a yard of some kind to get out into. And in whatever structure you're farrowing in, you need to make sure that it has, like I mentioned, areas that are well protected from drafts, and that it's all very easy to navigate for a little tiny creature. Once the pigs are over a week old, they're quite independent and they do really well, but under a week is when you're going to have almost all the losses. Little tiny pigs are dumb and they're weak, and if they can wander, you can have too big a space. If they wander too far away from their mother, they might not be able to find her again. If your exit from your indoor pen into your outdoor pen has a lip that's more than a couple of inches, they might get outside and they won't be able to climb back inside. If you put a ramp in so that they can climb back inside, they will end up under the ramp and stuck and confused and not able to get back in. So you have to be really careful to make things just smooth and easily navigable. A lot of operations use supplemental heat for piglets. If they're given the option, they want to be somewhere that's 85 or 90 degrees. So people will use heat mats or heat lamps in a creep area. I think I have a picture of that later. Yeah, this is a typical creep area with a heat lamp in it. It's certainly an option to do that if you want to, but it's also entirely possible to farrow without any of that stuff. I actually found that heat lamps irritated the sows, and so while the piglets liked the heat lamp and would use the creep area, the sow would get pissed off and she'd destroy that creep area so that she could get to the heat lamp and smash it. And in that process, she would crush piglets. And so what I ended up doing instead was I would avoid farrowing in the depths of winter, early January to early February. We'd just skip a litter. And then we would bed heavily with hay and just have a good tight structure that blocked all of the winds. And I would be careful to supervise those farrowings so I could get the piglets dried off right away so they weren't wet in the cold. And so I successfully farrowed in temperatures as low as 10 degrees without any supplemental heat with good survival rates. Yep.
Did you try mats at all? I know you're saying with the light, with the heat lamp.
Yeah, I never did. So that might work better. Yeah. Yeah, I think it would be most of the mats that I've seen are pretty, they're lightweight, and so it would have to be protected by a creep area and probably taken out when the pigs were maybe a week old or so and got strong enough to lift it up. Right. But yeah, my hunch is that, that would be a good idea. I can't say that from practical experience. Right. I just gave up on the lamps.
Yeah.
Adequate bedding is really important, though you can have too much of it. I tried bedding really, really, really deeply ahead of a farrowing once when there was cold weather expected, and there was so much bedding that the piglets got lost in it, and the sow couldn't see them even, and they got stuck in the hay, and she couldn't see where they were, and so I actually had increased losses with too much bedding. But a good, 8-inch deep bed of hay or straw is ideal. At farrowing time, everybody gets very excited, and you'll notice, you'll be able to often predict when a sow is going into labor. You won't always be able to see ahead of time, but usually you'll see a decrease in appetite, maybe either an increase in activity, or she's just lying down and not doing anything and doesn't want to be bothered. There may be a swollen vulva, discharge at the vulva, obvious signs of milk production in the udder. Even if the teats haven't filled out, you may be able to see enlarged veins leading into the udder. And those are all signs that something is going to happen within the next 48 hours or so. But I actually discourage people from hovering over a sow while she's in labor. The important thing is that that the facility be clean and that the sow stay calm. If you're popping in and out all the time and getting into the pen with her because you just can't wait to see what's happening, she's going to be more nervous, and that can stall her labor and cause more problems than it helps. So once I know a sow is in labor, I like to sneak in very, very quietly, hope that she doesn't notice me. And once there are piglets coming, you should be seeing a piglet every hour. If there's more than an hour between piglets, that is a sign that something is amiss. You can see in the top left here a normal presentation. That's how the pig should be coming out. Any pig that's positioned that way, even if it's dead, even if it's big, she'll be able to get it out. That's one advantage of pigs, is their births tend to be fairly uncomplicated because the size difference between a sow and a piglet is so huge that it's practically impossible for a piglet to become permanently stuck to the point that it's going to kill the sow. They can become stuck to the point that you have a stillborn. But that's not as big a deal as losing the breeding animal. But if you have a less than ideal presentation, it may take longer than it ought to. When pigs are like this, you usually see them coming out every 10 to 20 minutes. If you have one like this one with the legs tucked under it, or this one coming out breech, it makes the circumference of the pig larger, and it will take longer to pass. Usually they can pass piglets like that unassisted as well, but sometimes a smaller sow or one with a larger litter may need help. And then if you have a situation like this is when you're really going to run into trouble. Then she may be stalled for quite a long time, and these piglets that are backed up behind the one that's trying to come out spine first are going to die, and you can lose a significant portion of a litter that way. So once it gets to be much more than an hour between pigs, then you need to consider assisting. It's a pretty simple process. You want to have trimmed fingernails, wash up to here, disinfect with hydrogen peroxide, and use a mineral oil or other natural lubricant. And most sows, when they're in full labor like that, are not going to protest much with the pelvic exam. And I find it easiest to just if you look at these sorts of pictures ahead of time and get a sense of what things ought to be looking like, it's actually easier if you close your eyes. You can really figure out what's hoof and what's knee and what's nose and what's ear. And usually you need to just gently push the little piglet back in a little bit and then rearrange it and then gently pull it out. And the key is to just be, very as slow and gentle and methodical as possible and not rush that process. But you want to avoid assisting whenever possible, because if there isn't a problem that the sow can't deal with in her own time, assisting, even if you're as clean as you possibly can be, it does increase the chance of uterine infections afterwards. When pigs are born, there are some producers who like to do things to them right away. They always want to be present drying them off. A lot of people will clip the navel cord and dip the stump in iodine to prevent a navel and umbilical infection. Some people want to castrate as soon as the animal is born. I say don't do any of that unless it's really cold, in which case you want to dry them off. But again, being present like that tends to increase labor complications. And I was taught originally to do the navel dipping and the iodine to prevent navel ill. And when I stopped doing that and just made sure that the farrowing facilities were spotlessly clean and there was fresh bedding, I never lost a pig to navel ill. So I think as long as things are clean, it's really not necessary. And for things like castration and ID, I just like to give the pigs a few days to get used to being on this planet and alive and having bodies before I start messing with them. Those are all procedures that ought to be done young, but not as they are born. The first few days after farrowing are the most tender time for both the sow and the pigs. The problems that you need to be looking out for with the sow are retained placenta. Even after all of the pigs are born, you want to make sure that you see her passing placenta. It may come out in one piece. It may come out in chunks. They usually eat it, and so if you miss the whole thing, don't freak out if you can't find a placenta in the pen, because she probably just ate it. If you're not sure, you'll know if she retained it, because she'll end up having a fever, going off of her feed, and being noticeably ill. If you know that she's retained it, then I'm forgetting the word. What is the word? I didn't leave it for myself. I'm completely blanking on. There's a injectable that's used for inducing uterine cramps. Thank you. Yes. Give her that if she hasn't. It's most effective within 24 hours of farrowing. If you miss that window and there are signs of retained placenta or a uterine infection, then antibiotics are the only way to go, which is unfortunate if you're certified organic. You'll lose the organic status of that litter, but it will be necessary to save the life of the animal. It's common and normal for there to be discharge from the vulva following a farrowing, but it should be clear or straw colored and just smell like animal. If you've got like green, nasty stuff, then there's a problem. And if I see something like that, I'll give it 24 to 36 hours to get better on its own. It will about 50% of the time, and if it's getting worse, then antibiotics. There's a symptom that they call it fat sow syndrome. Like I mentioned earlier, if a sow that's over-conditioned is allowed to get pregnant, she's more likely to have postpartum complications. And that's this trio of mastitis, infection of the udder, metritis, infection of the uterus, and agalactia, which is a lack of milk production. And I've found that there's not really, obviously if the mastitis and the metritis are severe enough, it'll warrant antibiotics, but most of the times that I've actually seen this happen, it's mostly been a mild case of mastitis and a lack of milk production. And it's accompanied by a lack of appetite. It's like the sow is trying to fix her own body condition after she farrows. And I found that the most effective thing to do is to just feed her bulky, foods that will tempt her appetite without being calorie dense. Feed a lot of vegetables and fruits, and they'll usually ignore grain, but they'll happily eat produce. And you'll often end up with smaller wean weights on those litters, but everybody will survive, and the sow will usually even breed back again fine. And the other major thing to watch out for is udder wounds. We'll talk about needle teeth in a minute. If you choose not to clip teeth, the sow may get gashed by the piglet's needle teeth, and those wounds may require attention. Antiseptic applications and balms. Yep.
Do you wait a couple of days to do the needle teeth?
I do, yeah. They'll manage for a couple of days. It's all, we'll get to that in a minute. After the sow has farrowed, you want to keep her on that restricted poundage for her diet of 5 or 6 pounds, but increase the crude protein to 18%. And useful supplements. I like to feed some aloe vera after farrowing. It's an anti-inflammatory and can help with milk production. And then after that 3-day window, you start drastically increasing her ration to support her milk production. If you feed too much in those first 3 days, it increases the chances of mastitis. But then after the 3 days, she needs lots of calories to feed all those babies. And so my rule of thumb is that 5 or 6 pound base ration plus a 1/4 pound of feed per piglet per week of age. On large litters, that'll sometimes be more than the sow can eat. And if they're not finishing that portion, you may need to top dress their ration with some vegetable oil to get the calories in without the bulk.
Can you say that?
Yep. It's the 5 or 6 pound base diet plus 1/4 pound of feed per piglet per week of age. So on day 4, if she has 10 piglets, it's your first week, so it would be 1/4 pound of feed per piglet, so 2.5 pounds on top of the 5 or 6 pounds of feed. So you'd be looking at 7.5 pounds of feed for that week, and then you would increase that by another 2.5 pounds the following week. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in that same time span, your piglets are most likely to have problems with hypothermia if it's cold, starvation, crushing, and iron deficiency anemia. The hypothermia, mostly gone over. You can use supplemental heat or just lots of bedding and draft free. If you do find a piglet that's in cold weather, if it's wandered out of the nest and gotten chilled, you can often revive them. You bring them inside and you stick them in a lukewarm to bath temperature pot of water until they revive and start protesting that you're holding them in a pot of water. I've been pretty successful in bringing them, and once they're warmed up like that, you just dry them off and stick them back out there and they'll be fine. Sometimes they're too far gone and you just lose them, but that usually works. Starvation can be a problem if the litter is too large or if the sow has milk production problems. And I've gone over some of the milk production stuff. Again, aloe vera can be really helpful in stimulating that. If the litter is too large, you can either foster them inside, bottle feeding them, or if you have multiple sows that have farrowed at the same time, you can cross-foster them onto another sow. If that's an option, do that. You'll get sick of bottle feeding, and it's less successful. If you have another sow that you can give them to who's also has a smaller litter that was born within 2 weeks of this one, just rub the piglet with something strong smelling like peppermint oil so it's harder for her to identify it as a stranger, and try chucking it in there with the other piglets. If you decide to try fostering, sow milk is quite rich. You can mimic it pretty closely by blending whole milk. It's like a cup of whole milk, a cup of half and half, and some vegetable oil and an egg will come pretty close. But it's really hard to get. They suckle differently than cows and goats do. It can be pretty hard to teach them to drink from a bottle, and it's a task of sentimentality. It's not really economical to do that. But it's kind of fun. If you have kids, they might have fun with that project. But they do have to be fed often, and the success rate is pretty low. Crushing is why you need to look for breed stock with good maternal ability. A lot of sows in modern herds, they don't care because they stick them in farrowing crates, so they don't have to have good maternal instinct. But if you're going to treat the sow like a decent human being, she has to do you the favor in return of not crushing her piglets. And I've seen my best sows when they are when they get up, they will pick up one leg at a time, and then they will look around them, and then they'll take a step. They're so careful. And you'll see sows that don't have that instinct, and they're just like, oh, my food's over there, and they don't even pay attention to all of the screaming piglets that they just stepped on. So it's a real, it's a behavior thing, and it is definitely passed down in the genetic line. Iron deficiency anemia is very rarely lethal, but it can be it can restrict growth rates and just cause health problems. It will make the pigs lethargic, and so they're more likely to get crushed. Sow's milk does not have enough iron in it by itself for a piglet. They have to have some form of supplemental iron. If you farrow on pasture, you're all set. That's why sow's milk doesn't have enough iron, because pigs in nature have access to the soil, and they get, from a very early age, they'll be eating little bits of soil, and they'll get plenty of iron. If it's winter or you're farrowing indoors for other reasons, the easiest thing to do is to just bring in sod from outside. I would just dig up a few squares of sod in the fall and store them in the barn where I could get at them, and just throw them into the farrowing pen. You can also give iron shots or oral iron. To my knowledge, none of those formulations are approved for organic production, but there's nothing really fundamentally nasty about them, so if you're not certified organic, that's the way that most people go. And also, if you feed your sow a lot of iron in her diet, and the pigs have access to her feces, they can get enough iron that way. There's also some rock powder minerals like green sand that have a high concentration of iron, and if you put a pan of that in the pen, the piglets will root through that and get enough iron that way. When the pigs are 3 to 7 days old, they get the worst day in their life. Probably it's worse than slaughter, but this is where the tooth clipping comes in. You can see here these 4 sharp needle teeth. Some people call them wolf teeth. And there's an ongoing debate in high welfare pig husbandry circles about whether it is kinder to clip those teeth or leave them alone. I fall in the camp of it's kinder to clip those teeth, because I have seen awful damage done to sows' udders and to litter mates. They call it facial necrosis. The pigs will get each other with those needle teeth on the jowls, and you'll get infections, and it's awful. And I've heard, on the other side of the fence, people say, well, it hurts to clip the teeth, and then if you don't do it right, you can get abscesses in the jaws, and those are really painful. And there's reduced suckling behavior after the needle teeth clipping procedure. So, there are valid points on both sides. In 10 years of raising pigs, I never saw an issue with an abscess or an infection after needle teeth clipping. And I thought that it was worth it for the sow's comfort and the piglets themselves, really, that I'd rather have a quick dental procedure than weeks and weeks of rotting face wounds, personally. So I went that route. But not everybody does. And just want to make sure. Okay. I'm going to run out of time. But I'm in this room next, so I'm not going to be in anybody's way. And we've got half an hour between workshops, so we'll still have time for questions. Organic regulations and breed registries and probably some other people require your animals to be individually identified. There are several ways of doing that. What's diagrammed here is a traditional ear notching system that, so far as I know, is only used on pigs. Each ear has a number of sites on it that has a number traditionally assigned to it, And by clipping at those sites in various combinations, you can give just about any numerical combination that you need. And it's just just a quick little, there's a special tool for it that just notches a little bit of skin on the edge of the ear. It doesn't even really bleed very much. Other options are tattoos, which are also, a quick pinch, but not a major wound. The disadvantage of those is that they can be difficult to read, especially in dark-skinned animals. They can fade over time, especially as the animal grows larger. But they are permanent, and you can use any number of alphanumeric systems with those. I eventually switched from tattoos to ear tags. They make ones for pigs like to mess with things, so you can't use the long dangly kinds that you do for cows or sheep or goats because they'll rip them off of each other. But they make these little disc-shaped ones that you can put fully on the ear, so there is no overhang. And I had a pretty good retention rate with those. So you just mark them with a permanent marker, and it gets punched right through the ear. It's like getting your ears pierced. Again, not a major wound. For small crossbred herds, you can even just use a photograph if they all have slightly different stripes and speckles and splotches. The big operations use ear tags with radio frequency chips. It's an expensive system, probably not worth it for small producers, but you can, even instead of the tags, you can use embedded chips, so there's less chance of getting them lost. You have to decide young whether or not you're going to castrate the males. Most producers in the United States do. If you do not castrate, your growth rates are higher for the male pigs, but they also will produce more fat. And if you do not castrate, you have to segregate the males from the females as they're growing because you don't want the females getting bred too young. But the biggest risk of not castrating the males is the risk of boar taint in the meat. Uncastrated males will produce hormones and hormone byproducts called scatol and I always pronounce this wrong, and androsterone, something like that. It sounds like testosterone, but it begins with an A-N-D. Where is that? I did it right, androsterone. You won't be able to tell. It's slaughter. It'll just seem fine. And then you fry that pork chop, and your whole kitchen smells like a barnyard. Or your customer's kitchen smells like a barnyard, and they're not very happy. There are some breeds that are more, like not every uncastrated boar of slaughter age is going to have this problem. The rate varies a lot depending on the breed. Durocs almost always have it. American Guinea Hogs hardly ever have it, but they will sometimes. If you raise your pigs in dirty conditions and they're like constantly soiled with manure, the scatol levels will almost always be higher and you're more likely to have problems. There are a few things that you can do to reduce the risk of boar taint without castrating. One is to feed a lot of chicory root in the diet. That's an approach that even pretty large-scale Danish producers use. A lot of the European Union is trying to reduce or eliminate castration of pigs for welfare reasons. It's not a pretty process for pigs. Cows and goats and sheep can all be banded. You can't do that with a pig because the testicles don't hang free from the body. It has to be a surgical procedure. So it is a welfare concern, but most producers here do it because it's of such concern for meat quality in the end. There's a fairly new product on the market called Improvest, which is not in wide use here because a lot of both farmers and consumers confuse it with chemical castration, which is obviously forbidden for organic production, but it's actually not It's a vaccine, effectively, and is produced without genetic engineering. So I have yet to hear of any organic operations using it. When I talked to the Maine certifier, they were like, gee, we don't know. That sounds like it would be okay, but it also sounds kind of weird. So I'm not really sure. I think it's called Improvest.
Okay.
And it doesn't castrate the pigs. You still have to segregate the males from the females, but it eliminates the risk of boar taint. And it acts like a vaccine. So it's getting more widely used in Europe in response to the banning of surgical castration, and I'll be interested to see how widespread it becomes over here, or if there end up being problems with it that they haven't brought up yet. But if you do choose to castrate, then it should really be done before 10 days of age and preferably before 1 week of age. If you wait longer than that, there's a greatly increased risk of infection, and it's much more painful to the animal. So if you miss that window, it's best to find an alternative market for those animals as roaster pigs, or just slaughter them a little bit on the younger, smaller side, like slaughter them by 5 months. There's usually 2 rounds of vaccinations for piglets. One happens when the rest of this awful stuff happens, and then the second, they get their booster shots at weaning. What vaccines you give will depend on, where, like, on your production methods and where you live. Any pastured operation should be vaccinating for erysipelas. That's ERISYPELAS. And for salmonella. And often for, there's bacterial pneumonia that can be a problem on some operations, and streptococcus. There are a bunch of other diseases that most small-scale producers that are isolated from major pork production areas probably don't have to worry about, that might be very common vaccinations on most pig farms. But those ones that I just mentioned are diseases. All of those that I just mentioned are bacterial, and all of those bacteria tend to be carried in wet conditions, so out on pasture in the spring. It's carried in any standing water. It'll be carried by rats. It'll be carried by wild birds, wild pigs. So there are risks to pastured animals for those diseases that don't exist in confinement facilities. I recommend weaning pigs between the age of 6 and 8 weeks. Usually 6 weeks is fine. Exactly what age you wean at will partly depend on how big the piglets are and the body condition of the sow. You may need to wean a little bit earlier if she's getting really skinny. That's a lot later than most of the conventional operations wean, but that is because of both the behavior of the animals, the natural behavior of the animals, and the nutritional requirements of young pigs. Pigs retain a strong suckling instinct up until at least 3 weeks old. They don't really show any interest in solid food until then, and from 3 to 6 weeks, you'll see a sharp departure in behavior as the suckling goes down and the interest in solid food goes up. And pigs younger than 6 weeks have such high requirements for protein in their diet that it's really difficult to satisfy that requirement using the kinds of feed that we use on organic farms. In commercial facilities, they'll use things like spray-dried blood plasma and leather meal to get the protein level of nursery diets sky high. And so some of them are able to wean piglets as young as 4 or 5 days of age with synthetic diets and specialty nursery equipment. But we're not going to do that. one option, if a sow is losing condition on a large litter, or even if she's just a sow with high milk production, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can wean half the litter at a time. It's usually easiest anyway to wean pigs by taking the pigs away instead of by taking the sow away. And so if you take away, if you wean half the pigs, maybe a week or two in advance of the others, it'll give the sow's body time to adjust. It'll be less demand on her if she's losing condition, or just like a steady drop in the amount of milk that she has to produce, so she's less likely to get mastitis. And I meant to finish that a little ways earlier, so we had more time for questions, but we have half an hour between workshops. So if anybody does have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them. Yeah.
So I know with organic you can't deworm. Do you do anything, like I know with sheep you give like garlic juice and stuff like that. I didn't know if you did that anything for your breeding stock.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's the one thing about the organic regs for livestock that drives me crazy, because I think that using synthetic parasiticides judiciously in response to an existing problem can be part of good animal husbandry. And a lot of the natural worming remedies don't have a lot of research to back them up. Yeah, absolutely. So people rely on these things like garlic juice and are confident that they're helping, and they might not actually really be helping. There's absolutely not enough research done in that area, so some of it's just like, well, people tell stories. Maybe they're true, maybe they're not. Maybe there's really limited clinical studies. Often the clinical, the few studies that I've been able to drag up on some popular remedies like garlic and diatomaceous earth haven't been very promising.
Right.
So I don't like to rely on those things. What I did was I would test the breed stock themselves twice a year, usually once when they went out on pasture and once when they came back into the barn. Take fecal samples. I would send them away to, there's a lab in Wisconsin called, why am I blanking on these things today? Hold on, I can get it. They charge like $5 or $10 a sample, and they tell you what species of worms are present, and they give you egg counts. Mid-America Agricultural Research, that's the place. Okay. Yeah, they're great. They have a quick turnaround. And so that'll let you know whether you have a problem at all. That's actually, I should have mentioned that on the breed stock selection. There's parasite resistance and there's parasite tolerance in breed stock. And so my breeding herd had a really high tolerance to nodular worm. They could carry very high loads and not lose any productivity. And if I brought in a sow from off farm, she'd get the nodular worm from them and turn skinny as a rail. And so I would test for those worms, and if we had something that was really causing a problem, then you can treat the sows with synthetic parasiticides as long as it's not in the last trimester of gestation. So you can sort of stop the problem right there. But there's always the possibility of recontamination and all of that, and so the first line of defense always has to be genetics and rotating pasture, long pasture rotations, like 4-year pasture rotations, and just good sanitation. And there are some natural substances that do have some good clinical research backing them. Unfortunately, not for roundworm, which is the one that's most likely to cause production losses. But chicory root, in addition to helping prevent boar taint, also helps with nodular worm. And so you can either feed the dried root, which is more concentrated but also expensive, or when you reseed your pastures, include chicory seed in the mix. And if you have problems with coccidiosis, oregano oil is effective against that in many species. But roundworm, you just have to try to get it in the sow when she is not in the last trimester of gestation, and hope for the best.
Why would you put the oregano oil right on the grain?
You can top dress the grain, or you can. There's a product called Regano 500 that's, I believe it's OMRI listed. It's I know MOFCA's approved it for use, and that is water soluble. So you can just put it right into the tank of drinking water. Yep.
What so with the slaughtering, you have to use an organic slaughterhouse, correct?
Yeah.
Is there one? Like, what do you use in New England?
In Maine, we're really, really lucky. There's at least half a dozen state or federal inspected. I know.
But there's nobody here.
There's nobody. I know. I don't know why Maine got all of them. We have there's like half a dozen state or federally inspected slaughterhouses, and at least 2 or 3 of them are certified organic at this point.
Okay.
Then the rest of the New England, the rest of the country is kind of in a tight spot in that regard. I really don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
The closest one to Massachusetts.
In Maine, I think I always used one that was farther north. There's one.
Because you can't
Bisson's?
sell it as certified organic if you don't process it as certified.
Right.
Even
Yeah.
though they had organic grain, or they're out in the organic woods.
Yeah.
Bisson Slaughterhouse is in Topsom, and they're state inspected, so I don't think in Mass you could bring your meat up there and then come and sell it in Mass. It has to be federally inspected. Hold on. USDA. Oh, Wyndham's Way South. That's just a butcher shop, maybe. Nope, they do slaughter. I've never even heard of them. They're so far south from me.
They're organic too.
Those guys, I'm not sure. I believe herring, but looses I used a lot. I have no idea. I'm sort of out of the loop on this at this point. It's been a few years since I've been trying to do this. Luces is what is up north, though. That's like 3 hours north of the border. Wyndham and Sanford, I think, are both probably those are the farthest south, or Wyndham and Sanford. I don't know if either of those are certified, though.
Do you have a copy of your book here?
I don't. They have them in the exhibit hall.
Okay.
They usually ask authors not to compete with the booksellers and selling their own books.
Okay.
But they are available in the exhibit hall. And I'll be back. If you want me to sign it, I'll be, either here until 5. 5, I think, is when the next one ends. 5:30.
Yeah.
And then I'll be back down there for a few minutes afterwards.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
This is way too many results.
That's what I was thinking. I'm like, oh wow, there's a lot. And then
No,
scroll,
that's
and I'm like,
it's all cattle for slaughter.
right. Yeah, right. I'm like, that seems like that's a little too much.
Yeah. They'll try slaughterhouse.
Well, at least now I know of one, because like when I had looked, I couldn't even find it. Like, I'm like, what do people?
Yeah.
But I know of people like around, like, and I knew you had organic pay. Like, I knew people around it. And I'm like,
Right.
so obviously they're doing something.
Yeah. It looks like, let's see.
But I guess I'm also familiar with all the big ones too, like Adams and LeMay's.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's one up in Vermont that's, I don't know what the deal, like, that's where, I think they must be USDA, because I think there's a sheep farm in Maine that takes all of their lambs there. But I don't know if they're certified organic. I think they are. But yeah, it looks like the only ones that Herring Brothers and Luce's are both USDA and MOFGA certified, but they're both quite a ways up there.
Yeah.
Especially Herring Brothers. Dover and Foxcroft is a haul. Any other questions? I am going to... Are you all staying for the feed?
I'm not
piece?
sure yet.
Okay.
I'm not sure yet.
Okay, no big deal. I'm just going to, I've got my kids down in the exhibit hall, so I'm going to go down there and make sure that they haven't burned anything down. And I will be back in just a minute.
I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd be like everybody else.
You travel to Maine.
Yeah, but
Yeah, we have all the seed companies and all the slaughterhouses.
There you go. Yeah, I don't know where I would end up as a farmer, but I want independent. Like, some of the stuff I know that you can do organic, other stuff is kind of hard.
Yeah,
So I was trying to see, but at least if I know that there's at least
yeah.
something,
Right.
out there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like choosing to go organic or not on pigs, I think in terms of production, it's extremely doable.
Right.
Financially, it's hard because the feed costs so much more
Right.
money, and it's difficult to get that much more margin because somebody
Right.
marketing their pork as natural can get almost as much money as you can.
Yeah.
I never really felt, I've always thought of it as a greenwashing scheme for genetically engineered grain.
Right.
But, in the markets, it is what it is, and
Yeah.
that's the reality.